All right, so the meeting is being recorded, I hear. So hello everyone, good evening. Thanks for having me. My name is Maaike Beenes. I'm the coordinator of the climate team at BankTrack. BankTrack is an NGO that focuses on commercial banks and their sort of involvement in a range of issues. Fossil fuels is one, but we also look at deforestation and human rights, for instances. And I'm the coordinator of the climate team, so where we focus on fossil fuels mostly. And our office is based in Nijmegen, but fun fact, I've never visited it. And I've only met two of my colleagues face to face because I joined the organization during the lockdown. So it's been a lot of Zoom meetings like this one. So tonight I would like to present one of the major projects that we work on, which is the Banking on Climate Chaos report. In this report, we, together with a whole range of other NGOs, including the Rainforest Action Network in the United States, but also Reclaim Finance in France, investigate bank financing for the fossil fuel industry. This focuses on the 60 largest banks and the loans and underwriting that they give to 2,300 companies involved in the fossil fuel value chain. So that is just to give you an impression that this is quite a comprehensive research that we do. And I would like to give you some insight in the results that we found this year. But maybe just as a really brief introduction to remind ourselves that we're already beyond 1 degree global warming, and the current pathway is really leading us to climate chaos, which is why we called our report Banking on Climate Chaos. So this is really to remember the urgency of what we're dealing with. And I don't know if anyone has seen this chart before. This is some really great graphic by Oil Change International, who did some calculations and research showing that if we want to stay within the carbon budget that we have to remain to 1.5 degree global warming, that means, basically is what the chart says, is that we cannot develop any new reserve of fossil fuels. So even all the existing developed projects that are out there are already enough to get us to 1.5 global warming, meaning we cannot do any new fossil fuel projects. So that is just a really stark and really clear red line. Then earlier this year, there was also the International Energy Agency, IEA, which historically has been very much a friend of the fossil fuel industry, who came out with a report which again concluded that there should not be any new investments in new fossil fuel projects. So even this really big organization, so much in the pockets of this industry, is now saying we shouldn't be developing any new fossil fuel projects. And this is some really, like a really important background information to keep in mind when we look at the data that we found in our research. Because what our research shows is that banks are still driving us towards climate chaos. Over the last 5 years, so since the Paris Agreement was signed, 60 major banks have poured $3.8 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. $3.8 trillion is a number that I can't even really comprehend, but it's a massive amount of money. And if we then take a little bit of a closer look, we see that JP Morgan Chase, it's quite a well-known American bank, is by far the biggest financier of fossil fuels. But we also see, for example, Barclays and HSBC in the top 10 of fossil fuel bankers. And what is also very striking is that the fossil fuel finance provided by these 60 banks over the last 5 years has been increasing. So since the Paris Agreement was negotiated, banks have only provided more financing to the fossil fuel industry rather than less. And another quite shocking little fact is that 39% of this fossil fuel financing went to expansion companies. So what I explained before, that even the International Energy Agency is now saying we shouldn't be doing any new fossil fuel projects. A lot of this fossil fuel financing by banks is actually going to companies that are still expanding the fossil fuel industry. So in the report, we look at fossil fuels and a number of specific subsectors that are especially have a special impact on the environment, but also, for example, on human rights. And I won't go into all the details because then 10 minutes will be over super soon. But just to give you sort of an impression of the trends that we're seeing when we look at fossil fuel finance. So tar sands is a type of fossil fuel that has really severe impacts on the environment, but is also related to violations of indigenous rights. And this is actually a sector where luckily we've seen a decrease in financing. And we're quite hopeful that financing peaked sort of in 2017, which would be a really good scenario, even though fossil fuel like finance for this sector is still way too high. Financing is dominated by Canadian banks, which makes a lot of sense because tar sands is also dominated by, it's mostly extracted in Alberta in Canada. Another sector that we look at is Arctic oil and gas. Again, the Arctic region is of course very sensitive. And here we've actually seen an increase in financing. Even though most of the major American banks have by now committed to not fund projects drilling in the Arctic. But as always, there's usually a little snake in the grass, we say in Dutch. I don't actually know if that's an expression in English. There's like a little hidden secret, which is that there's actually hardly any project finance for Arctic oil and gas. What usually happens is that banks provide financing to the companies doing the drilling. So even though most major US banks have come out saying they won't fund these types of projects, we've actually seen financing for companies involved in it increase. Then if I go on to fracking, fracking is dominated by American banks, but we've actually seen financing by Barclays increase by 24% since 2019. Even though fracking is also very well known for its really severe environmental impacts. And I think another interesting one to pull out is LNG, liquefied natural gas, because there's this really big misconception that we need gas as a transition fuel. And we also see that a lot when we talk with banks. That is something that we hear time and time again, that they think, okay, even though, you know, coal mining, we understand we shouldn't be financing that anymore, but gas, don't we need that as a transition fuel? And that you also see back in the financing data that we find, because there's been a really big increase in financing for LNG, and all of the major banks are involved in this sector. And the same actually goes for fossil fuel expansion. As I mentioned before, there's quite a lot of financing still going into expansion, even though everybody knows by now we shouldn't be doing that anymore. And there's even been an increase in financing for expansion. The coal mining and coal power are dominated by Chinese companies and Chinese banks, which makes them also quite hard to campaign on. So I wanted to take a little bit of a closer look at the UK banks. We made this graph showing the total financing over the last 5 years by the top 5 European banks financing of fossil fuels. And we see Barclays came out well on top. So they're the biggest financier in Europe of fossil fuels, and they're also number 7 in the report as a whole. So globally, they're the number 7. And some in the report, we also look at case studies. So cases of fossil fuel projects that have particular impacts on human rights, on the environment. And there we often see Barclays involved. So that includes, for example, the Line 3 tar sands pipeline that you may have heard of in the United States, where there's a lot of protests going on at the moment. But also drilling in the Barents Sea, fracking in Argentina, Vaca Muerta, where there's also, again, violation of indigenous rights. And HSBC is the third in Europe. They're the 13th, so it's really high up there also globally. And there we again also see them being involved, for example, in an LNG project in Mozambique, offshore drilling in Ghana, and again the Vaca Muerta fracking in Argentina. And then there's 3 other UK banks that are listed in the report. They are Standard Chartered, NatWest, and Lloyds. And even though they are not in the top 5 of Europe, they all still provide way too much financing for the fossil fuel industry. And what is also interesting to note maybe here is that in addition to looking at the financing that banks provide, we also look at the policies that they already have in place to limit what financing they give to fossil fuels. And what we see here is that almost all banks score really, really low. And all of the UK banks that we list in the report have less than half of the total points that they could earn. So, for example, the highest scoring UK bank in the report is NatWest, which has only 43 out of 200 points. So that again shows how little they are doing, especially if you then compare to that financing that they are still providing. So one of the cases that we looked at in the report and the campaign that at Banktrack we are really actively involved in is a campaign to stop the East African crude oil pipeline. This is a pipeline that is at the moment still proposed and partially under development by a Chinese company. It's called the China National Offshore Oil Corporation and the well-known French company Total. And this oil pipeline is meant to transport oil from northern Uganda to Tanzania. And there it could be then exported into international markets. And if they complete this pipeline, it will be the longest heated pipeline in the world. And it would carry 216,000 barrels of crude oil per day. So here again, remember that all of the research says we shouldn't be doing any new fossil fuel projects. And then they are building this new pipeline. Research has shown that the oil being transported by this pipeline would likely result in 33 million tons of CO2 emissions each year. And that is greater than the current combined emissions of Uganda and Tanzania, just by this one oil pipeline. But what is also really important is that this pipeline would sort of create the infrastructure that is needed to develop oil fields in Uganda, which really means that this pipeline is facilitating the expansion of the oil sector in this region. So this is just one example of the kind of projects that we are looking at and that we are also really actively trying to stop. And I included this graphic here because it has a list of all the banks that we think may be involved in the project, because the banks listed here had financial relationships already with this Chinese company Crude and Total. So one of the actions that we together with the coalition have been taking is to write to all these banks and ask them to come out publicly and say that they will not finance this pipeline. And the ones on the left have said that they will not. So Barclays in this particular case is on the good side. But for example, from HSBC, we've not heard, they've not been willing to confirm that they will not finance this pipeline. So that is sort of an example of the type of campaigning that is maybe a little bit more concrete than the trillions that are flying around your ears in the report. And I just wanted to touch briefly also on some concept that you may have heard in the news also recently, is the net zero concept. A lot of banks have been coming out with promises and pledges to reduce the emissions that they finance to zero by 2050. And this is really sort of the new talk of the town in the banking sector. And also corporations are coming out with pledges like this all the time. So for example, Shell has also come out with a net zero statement. And Citi, one of the biggest fossil fuel financiers, has also promised to be net zero by 2050. And this trend actually started in the UK in early 2020. So NatWest and Barclays and HSBC all came out with a promise like this. And what is important about this is that it sounds great. Of course, yes, net zero by 2050. But here again, there's a snake in the grass. And then what are these banks really promising? What are they really saying that they will do? And what we often see is that they will make a promise for 2050, but that is really far away. Whereas what we need is them to take action today. So what we are asking them is to also set targets for 2025 or 2030, because if they don't do that, then if they don't take that type of immediate action, a 2050 commitment is really meaningless.
Can you get to the end, please?
Yes, I'm almost done.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, I'll skip this slide. For the Stop ECOP campaign, there's also an opportunity for folks everywhere to take action. So if you go to the website of the Stop ECOP campaign, you can join all sorts of action. For example, sending a message to the banks that are involved. And some shameless self-promotion. With BankTrack, we've recently launched a campaign platform, the Fossil Banks No Thanks platform, where we bring together a lot of organizations and campaigns that are working on banks and the fossil fuel industry. So for example, the Stop ECOP campaign will be able to sort of present the campaign that they are doing, the work that they are doing. And we hope that this will really be a place for people to find each other and also to find information about fossil fuel finance. So if you're new to this issue and you're not really sure where to start, we have a lot of resources on our website there. So that was it for me. I have our website and Twitter up here.
That's great. Thank you very much, Maaike. And if you want to put some information in the chat, people can follow the links. Now we move on. Andy Georgiou is a climate campaigner and a policy advisor. He's worked against fracking and against gas infrastructure projects in many countries, and he's going to talk about that. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks also for the invitation. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, right. So as Simon has mentioned it, I'm a freelance campaigner and consultant, but I've also worked for an NGO called Food and Water Europe, based in Brussels. Mother NGO is called Food and Water Watch, based in Washington. So over the last 4 years or so, I had a very strong transatlantic perspective, and I've also supported groups in different countries who fought fracking. And by doing that, I've bumped into INEOS, and I assume many of you, some of you are familiar with INEOS. And what astonished me was the fact that this company was moving forward with fracking projects in the UK, but not because they wanted to supply the UK with energy, but because they themselves, as a petrochemical and plastics company, need oil and gas to A, feed their very energy intensive facilities, but also B, use oil and gas as a feedstock to produce plastics. INEOS is UK's and EU's top #1 producer of ethylene, and ethylene is the building block for a variety of plastics, but the biggest markets in Europe, but also worldwide, are in packaging. So this is one part of the story. The other part has to do with the fact that INEOS has started, and they're kind of like playing a pioneer role, started to import frack gas also in the meantime from the US in order to feed their petrochemical facilities in Scotland, at Grangemouth, but also in Norway, Roughness, and in Belgium at Antwerp. While looking into the company, we've also found out about the history of the company and how they grew by acquiring more and more debt. And related to this debt is, of course, their relationship with banks. So I'm going to try to do a bumpy ride into the corporate history of INEOS, explain their main investments over the past few decades, but also try to outline some of their lenders. And related to that is this report that you can see here, Facing Finance, was published in March this year, and looked into some major banks who are financing the main plastic producers in Europe. Okay, let's give it a go. So what you see here is a pretty complex picture of the corporate structure of INEOS, with a company named INEOS Limited at the core of it. INEOS Limited is based on the Isle of Man, which is a tax haven. And this company itself is surrounded by companies based in Switzerland, partly not because there's fresh air there, but because the main owner of INEOS, which is Mr. Sir Jim Ratcliffe, seek to find a tax asylum some years ago. So the unique thing about INEOS is that this man actually owns this company. We do have, with other majors, we do have a bit more of a complex structure, and you do have more shareholders that you can influence. But with this company, it is pretty heavy, because INEOS equals Jim Ratcliffe INEOS equals INEOS, and it is his relationship in particular to certain banks and the financial sector that has opened doors up to this very day into the financial sector to feed a company or parts of the company that are in actual fact not really profitable, while at the same time he himself as a private person was capable of extracting a lot of wealth out of the company. So there you go, Jim Ratcliffe, almost 62%, and then these other two guys, roughly 20%. Now, let's have a look of how INEOS started and where they are right now. It all started in 1998 in Antwerp, where Jim Ratcliffe bought a company for £91 million. But then quite quickly, they've evolved from buying this one petrochemical plant at Antwerp for 91 million to acquiring almost the entire petrochemical sector of Imperial Chemical Industries, which was a major British petrochemical company, for £505 million. So, I mean, these numbers alone show you that they needed to have a lot of investors or banks behind them to be able to do that. And then only a few years later down the road, they've acquired or bought, in actual fact, Innovine from BP. And with Innovine, they basically bought the whole Grangemouth complex. And the 5.1 billion takeover required 4.9 billion in bank loans. So, I mean, this says it all. He needed the banks to be able to do that. Now, 3 years later, 2008, we in the aftermath or during the financial crisis, a company like INEOS was also heavily struggling. The debt towered at 6.7 billion pound, and they had to pay almost 700 million in fees to banks. And this is roughly, so during this time, he had to make some decisions about closing down assets or coming up with some kind of idea that might save his business. So the idea that he presented between 2008 and 2010, 11, 12 was to invest heavily into constructing a huge ship fleet. They have their own class of ships, in actual fact. They're called dragon ships. And the purpose was to use these ships to import frack gas from the United States in the form of ethane, which was very cheap back then. It still is kind of like the pandemic did some corrections, but we're kind of like back to where we were before. But anyhow, he saw that there's access to this very cheap raw material, which could make his otherwise unprofitable business in Europe profitable again. So he managed he also moved with his headquarters to Switzerland. He managed to get a loan from the UK government for the largest frack gas storage tank at Grangemouth, but he also managed to convince some of these major banks to invest into the construction of these ships and into the implementing of the supply chain of frack gas coming into Europe. So, and by doing that, they've also started to invest into upstream assets. So they've transformed through this decision from a pure downstream petrochemical plastic production company to a company that actually does the actual upstream extracting of oil and gas. But again, they wouldn't have been able to do this without the support of major banks. First, US frack gas arrives in Norway and Scotland in 2016. This feeds also the 5-ethylene plant, which is owned by ExxonMobil and Shell. And then another takeover from a Danish company for North Sea gas fields. The takeover of the Forties pipeline system happens also in 2017. And in 2017, also an announcement to build the biggest butane storage tank at Antwerp, all based on access to cheap frack gas. And just 2 years ago, they've also announced that they want to build they want to invest €3 billion and build the first ethane cracker, the first of its kind over the past 20 years at Antwerp. And again, this whole infrastructure will be fed or is being fed already by climate hostile frack gas. Last year, they also bought the entire petrochemical sector from BP, which is roughly 5 to 25% of BP's assets. But nonetheless, and this is quite interesting, nonetheless, this company still carries high debt with them. This is from their 2020 annual report. Their own words, our level of indebtedness could adversely affect our ability to react to changes in our business, and we may be limited in our ability to fulfill our obligations. We are significantly indebted, and as of December 31st, 2020, had total consolidated loans and borrowings of over 7 million euros. Now, who are the banks who are kind of like still believing in Jim Ratcliffe and his complete past-orientated plastics polluting and climate polluting business model? Here they are, presented by the Dirty Profits report launched by Facing Finance in March 2021. And among them, we do see BNP Paribas. We also saw them in the other presentation, Commerzbank, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, ING, Santander, UBS, and UniCredit. And I mean, here are more players here, so quite interesting to see that Enios is even, a small company in relation to the loans that some banks are giving to them. But nonetheless, this is basically what keeps Enios alive. It's the stream of money coming from banks like BNP Paribas, who, funny enough, have an anti-shale policy in actual fact since 2017. So through the plastics and petrochemicals business of Enios, they're kind of like undermining their own policy, where they've said that they won't further invest in shale development, but by investing in Enios, they actually do. Here's the same graph, which shows you more the biggest streams. We do see that Enios is not the main recipient of some of the loans, but companies like Eni, ExxonMobil, Shell, Dow DuPont, and these are, again, this report looked at major plastics producers. But when we look at the names of the companies, we realize that in actual fact, the plastics petrochemical sector equals the oil and gas sector. So, and you do have on both sides the same companies, and both sectors contribute heavily to the severe plastic crisis that we have, but also to the climate crisis. In actual fact, we do have numbers that say that if plastic production goes on the way it does nowadays, the plastic sector alone will eat up 10 to 13% of our CO2 budget that we have left to stay within a 1.5 global warming scenario.
Andy, can you bring it to an end?
Yes, I will. So how's the performance of INEOS, or what do I get for my money? I just kind of go through that without commenting. So there you go. Grenfell spouse urge Osborne to break unions. Plastic pollution in force, worse than expected. Same at Antwerp. These are plastic noodles, not very far away from an INEOS facility in Antwerp. INEOS plea to keep a dangerous US fracking pipeline open for their supply chain. Green taxes are killing European investment, says INEOS boss Radcliffe. INEOS breaches Grangemouth, risk catastrophic accident. And finally, INEOS damned as very poor for pollution at Grangemouth. This happens, I think, in a row for the fourth year or so. And that's the reason why we do have, in a lot of countries, a lot of opposition against INEOS. But we shouldn't forget that all of that wouldn't have been possible without the banks that gave INEOS the money in the first place. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. There's a huge amount there. If you have questions or points you want to put to these speakers, you can put them in the chat or hold them until Pascoe's finished talking and ask them yourself. Pascoe Sabido is a researcher and campaigner at the Corporate Europe Observatory. He has focused on the way that corporations lobby in Brussels, the European institutions. And Pascoe, please, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Can you hear me? All good? Right, so I unfortunately am rubbish and do not have a presentation. So you're gonna have to put up with this rather than some lovely slides. Hopefully it means I won't speak over time. I'm looking at the time now. I'm gonna try and give myself 10 minutes. I might squeeze 12. As Simon introduced me, I work for Corporate Europe Observatory. We've been trying to expose the oil and gas lobby for many years now. I have to admit, I'm an expert. Well, no, I'm not an expert. I work on lobbying rather than finance. But I mean, what we've heard from both Micah as well as Andy is we see where the finance is going. But what I would like to show is why it's still going there. Why is the financing of fossil fuels carrying upwards, as Micah's terrifying graph showed? I mean, maybe you've got your own responses. Maybe write in the chat if anyone knows why financing is going up. I'm sure amongst this group of people, there's quite a few different theories. I'm going to give my own. Because I mean, private banks some are pulling out, like we heard, of the East Africa crude oil pipeline, some other projects. This is from pressure from social movements and NGOs. So I think first of all, we need to say there has been, any movement has come from folks like yourselves, like ourselves, and the movements that we've been sort of building, but it's still flowing. And I guess for me, the reason I think the money's still flowing is political support. Very simply put, it's political support, both for direct support for fossil fuel projects, as well as rarely opposing it. When I mean political support, it's from our governments, supposedly democratically elected governments. And in there, incredibly important, is the influence of industry. So lobbying is very important when we come to look at why is money still flowing. So I'm going to maybe spell out the obvious, but the fossil fuel industry is a key part of the economy. I mean, the product itself isn't so much. We just heard about the petrochemicals industry and plastics, but it's everywhere, as well as the entire financial system. It's so deeply ingrained. It's also a huge employer. It makes huge investments. Pardon? Oh. Okay, I'll ignore that. I thought that maybe Andy coming in, an accidental mic, makes huge investments. But do not forget, the fossil fuel industry used to be state-owned in many, many countries, particularly, BP. We look at BP, it was state-owned. So there is a big link between the fossil fuel industry and securing our national security. Simply put, projecting national power, as it used to be state-owned. Therefore, there's this long-standing relationship between the fossil fuel industry and government. I mean, the BP, let's just dig into it a tiny bit. I'm going to, rather than giving a presentation with slides, I'm going to put a few links as I talk in the chat. But BP has a very close relationship to the UK government. It's had staff seconded when we used to have a Department of Energy and Climate Change. I'm sure this is still happening. You've got Tory ministers who've flown out to Russia to sign oil and gas deals. You know, a minister signing on behalf of BP, and the revolving door between BP and the UK government. So people have gone from the UK government to work for BP, or vice versa, is massive. So here is a great article from Declassified on the revolving door between the fossil fuel industry and the UK government. And it shows a lot of it, in fact, is in the military sector. So ex-military personnel going in both directions, because fossil fuels are strategic interests. But this political support is also gained by industry through PR, so public relations, advertising campaigns, these sorts of things, and lobbying. So buying this social license and then using it to prop up that political support. So I was going to touch on a few small things. It's interesting that it was interesting for Micah to hear financing of coal is now mainly Chinese banks, partly because there's been huge campaigns to push coal out in Europe and in the US and many other parts of the world. You know, we've got these powering past coal campaigns, but also it's worth noting that in the early 2010s, from say 2011 up until 2015, there was a campaign from the oil and gas industry, which really came alive in 2014, 2015 towards the climate talks in Paris, that threw the coal industry literally under the bus. The oil and gas industry realized, if we want a future, we need to say coal is dirty and gas is clean. And that has been the big narrative that's come out of BP, Total, Shell. All of these big companies have been throwing the coal industry under the bus to try and present themselves as clean. You know, we're part of the transition, we can partner with renewable energy, etc., etc. I just say it's complete rubbish. If people have looked into the figures, fossil fuel gas, in fact, can have a footprint as big as coal, because I don't know if people know what gas is made of. It's made of methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas, which over a 10-year period is more than 100 times more powerful at capturing heat in our atmosphere than CO2, which means, unfortunately, when you drill for it, when you transport it, huge amounts escape into the atmosphere. And these leaks and these escapes mean that it has a carbon footprint often bigger than coal, particularly in the US. So do not believe the hype. When they say it's, you know, half the emissions of coal when you burn it, maybe when you burn it, but not along the supply chain. But this is the narrative comes out, which is, you know, gas is clean. So therefore banks feel more comfortable spending money on clean fuels. But so combine this narrative along with a bit of geopolitics of we need to move away from Russia and have security of supply in Europe. What we saw was a huge number of cross-border gas infrastructure projects being built in Europe of this sort of clean gas, supposedly clean fossil gas, which is rubbish. We saw pipelines, LNG terminals, so liquefied natural gas. We saw compressor stations, which can compress and decompress gas. And the EU classified these projects as projects of common interest, PCIs, projects of common interest. And every year, a list was drawn up, every 2 years, sorry. And these projects, and this is where it's the relevant bit, these projects would get political and financial support from the EU. So political support, but also financial support from the EU itself through EU funds, but also then public banks. So there are more than 100 gas projects in these lists. And just to be clear, building infrastructure drives demand because once you have it in place, you need to be using it. So this infrastructure is also driving demand around the world to supply Europe, be that fracked gas in the US or elsewhere. And this infrastructure got subsidies, EU gas infrastructure subsidies of more than 4 billion euros. But money-wise, so that's from the EU, then the public development banks. So I don't know if people heard of the European Investment Bank, the world's biggest development bank. In fact, it funded, then chucked in loads of money at these gas projects. So I don't know if people have heard of the Adriatic pipeline, TAP. Has anyone heard of TAP? I'm looking, sorry, Tamsin, I can only see you, Peter, and Ferdy. I see Simon's hand, so I'm just going to pick on you when I ask questions. Apologies. But anyway, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, it comes from the border of Greece to Italy, and it's the last bit of a massive pipeline bringing gas from Azerbaijan into Europe. Anyway, it got 1.5 billion from the European Investment Bank. It got another 500 million from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and then the private money comes in. So once the public banks have come in and made this scene acceptable, then the private banks come in. So looking at TAP, Micah mentioned BNP Paribas being one of the, sort of the big banks. They were one of the funders. Also mentioned Standard Charter. They were one of the funders of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. So once the public money comes in and this public support that we think it's safe, then the private money flows. So it's really important when we're looking at this that we look at both the political support, then the public finance, and then the private finance comes. But it's worth stepping back just a little bit and asking, how are these projects even chosen? And this is where the fossil gas lobby comes in. So to choose projects such as TAP, to choose all these big infrastructure projects, the European Union asked the fossil gas lobby, literally asked the very companies who build pipelines, they asked them to estimate, first of all, how much gas the EU would need in 10 years' time. Then it asked them to provide a list of projects to meet that. But what happens year after year with the gas companies overestimated how much gas the EU would need. Because of course, they're gas companies, they want to build infrastructure. So they massively overestimated how much gas was needed and then provided a list of projects to meet this inflated demand. And then they go and build them. So they estimate how much gas is needed, they then give a list of projects, and then they go and build them with taxpayers' money and then private bank loans. It's quite mad. This lobbying group that was sort of behind it, created by the European Union, was called ENTSO-G, so the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Gas. It's a bit of a long word. But yeah, the members built 75% of proposed projects, and they got 90% of this 4 billion from EU funds went to the same gas companies who are advising the EU of what projects they should build. So they not only advised them, they then took the money to build the projects. A huge conflict of interest. So that's one of the reasons the money is still flowing. But been great campaigning to see gas as stopped being seen as a clean fuel. So gas is no longer seen as a clean fuel. It's now being seen more as methane, as fossil gas. And we heard the European Investment Bank, who was one of the big funders, the European Investment Bank has said it's no longer going to fund fossil gas. The European Commission has said when it's changing this what's called the PCI list, it's going to no longer fund fossil gas. It sounds great, doesn't it? Since the EIB, the European Investment Bank's announcement, it's invested almost 1 billion in fossil gas, 890 billion to be precise. And this new PCI list that's been created, the EU is reforming, how it draws up these gas projects or energy projects. Has it changed? No, the gas industry is still in the driving seat and is still in charge. So we're not seeing a big change here.
Draw it to a close?
Yep. I still got 1 minute according to me. Okay. All right, just ticked over. Right. But I was going to say the gas industry is still completely in charge, which means unfortunately we're still funding projects such as the EastMed pipeline, a massive pipeline coming from Cyprus into Europe, as well as many others. And what we're going to see is this political support leads to public banks supporting it and then private banks. And maybe in questions we can get to, I can give what are the sort of things on the horizon that are now, be it a snake in the grass or a loophole or whatever we call it. There's some big ones on the horizon which are going to allow, unfortunately, fossil fuels to carry on being funded whilst being rebranded as green, one of them being hydrogen. But I'll stop there.